Hi, my name is Ankit, and today I'll be talking about the ethical implications of programmatically generated content. So, the organization of the talk is divided into three parts. In the first part, I'll be talking about the biases associated with foundation models, or commonly also called as like generative models or large language models alike. In the second part, I'll be talking about the privacy issues that arise in the way these models are trained and the content they generate. And in the third part, I'll be dealing with what are the trust issues that arise with such generated content. So now, moving on to the first part. So in the first part, I'll be talking about biases. So one of the common biases that occurs in models is the political bias. Now, political bias is a general term and it can encompass other forms of biases such as gender bias and other forms of biases. Now, the reason why political bias is so important is that given such models, the scale at which such models are used, it's very important to have a model that is somewhat neutral. When the model is not neutral, it is very easy to use such a model based on its alignment on the political spectra and be used by bad actors to impact elections or for enforcing media narratives by different media houses based on their own alignment with the help of these models or to spread propagandist information. The second form of bias is the socio-demographic bias. Now, these biases are arising because the data sets on which these models are trained, they are heavily diverse in nature, and that is because mainly of the variance in the demography. A common problem that arises because of this is that it becomes very difficult to moderate your content of such generative AI. For example, if you have a content moderation layer on top of, for example, ChatGPT or any other text generation model, it becomes difficult to actually have a uniform a uniform hateful classifier, for example. For example, in our case, the example that I'll talk about is how if you use a hateful sentence against one demographic group, let's say disabled person versus a wealthy person, the content moderation system would flag the hateful sentence as the one which has disabled, whereas the one which has wealthy won't be flagged or has a very low likelihood to be flagged. Now, what this tells us is that there needs to be a lot more transparency and democratization because many of these content moderation systems they are relying on annotation processes from humans, but we do not really know about them. Now, moving on to the second part, data privacy is a very important topic because given the large amount of data that these models are trained of, you might think that they are also following the privacy rules, but that is not really the case. For example, you can see that this image of a Premier League match and the generated image, they are very similar. Now, this showcases that many images that are used in the dataset that comprise these datasets are often copyrighted and actually require consent for users. However, many datasets which these large language models or generative models such as Stable Diffusion are using are actually not following these rules and rather disregarding it. So it's very important to have a consensual framework that would safeguard the privacy and the copyright laws of the curators and contributors. And one such method that is often suggested for the data is to have a properly documented data in the form of a data card. Now, moving on to the third part, that is trust issues. Why do we find it difficult to trust generated content? If I would tell you to look at these two images and identify which of them are actually AI generated and which of them are not, what would be your answer? Take a second and look at it. If your answer is the right one, or the left one, in both cases you are wrong. And the reason for that is because both of these images are actually generated by stable diffusion. Now, the problem that arises with this is that since we cannot actually differentiate it with the naked eye, such images can be spread over a social network such as Twitter or Facebook very easily and can be used for many possible wrong scenarios. Specifically with respect to text generation models, especially the large language model, the issue lies with respect to hallucination. The way I think of hallucination is, imagine a scenario where you're giving an interview and you have to give an answer irrespective of whether you know the correct answer or not. In most cases, when you're asked an answer and you're forced to give an answer irrespective, you will probably provide an answer that is somewhat made up but isn't actually correct. So that is how I think of hallucination in terms of text generated by large language model. In many cases, you might ask it a question or in the form of a prompt, but the large language model might not have the exact or the correct answer. Now, why is this an issue? Because large language models, because they're hallucinating, and when they're used as sort of like a one-on-one replacement for a search engine, now that can be problematic. Because in a search engine, you have a lot of further options and lot of further information that you can check for. But an answer generated by a chatbot, such as ChatGPT, well, that has only one. And how can you verify that really? So here lies your problem. And it's very easy to actually be led into believing that the answer is true. Now, it's very important to develop systems that can verify these content sources because of the threat that lies with respect to misinformation. Some of the recent methods that have been proposed, especially for text generation, include GPT-0, Detect GPT, which uses distributional and likelihood similarities between generated text and the human text, and others include watermarking. However, it is important to note that with the advent of such generative models, there are so many other multiple modalities that can be generated, such as videos, text, images, and there needs to be a lot more work that has to be done to verify whether it's a generated image versus a real image. So finally, I would like to conclude by stating that the current state of generative AI has lots of issues. However, these generative AI can be very helpful and can be used for a variety of tasks, but their large scale deployment depends on how these biases and issues are handled in the future.